Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm Commander B.J. Armstrong. I'm the Principal Associate of the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies, as well as the Associate Chair in the History Department here at the Naval Academy. Welcome to the second event in our inaugural series of First Bell Lectures in Naval Leadership and History. It's a new lecture series. It's a joint initiative of FINHSS and the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. The Stockdale Center was established in 1998 and renamed in honor of Vice Admiral James Bond Stockdale, class of '47, in February of 2006. For over 2 decades, the center has been a valuable resource for the Naval Academy and its students that aims to empower leaders to make courageous and ethical decisions. The Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies is an initiative of the History Department here at the Academy. An understanding of the naval and maritime past has a direct impact on the ability of today's Navy and Marine Corps to plan and operate effectively in the present and in the future. We've founded FINHSS in order to develop our collective understanding of that past and to encourage collaboration in the wider field of seapower studies, both here at the Academy and more widely. The Stockdale Center and FINHSS would like to thank William C. Stutt, USNA class of 1949, for his generous donation that supports this lecture series, and we'd like to thank the Naval Academy Foundation for their help as well. Today we're joined by Dr. Bruce Jones. Dr. Jones is Director of the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where for 4 years he also served as the Vice President. He's lived and worked in Asia, Africa, and Europe, including serving with UN operations in Kosovo and the Middle East. He's documented the changing dynamics of world power in several previous books about international affairs, and he's been a senior advisor to the World Bank and has lectured or been a non-resident fellow at Princeton, Stanford, Yale, and New York University. And hopefully he'll now add the Naval Academy to that list. In today's talk, it's based on his new book, To Rule the Waves, How Control of the World's Oceans Shapes the Fate of Superpowers, which has been described by General David Petraeus as, quote, a brilliant, compelling, and clear-eyed view of the central challenge the U.S. confronts in the new dynamics of great power competition, unquote, and by Ambassador Michael McFaul as, quote, a masterpiece, unquote. Dr. Jones.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me, BJ, Chris, where is Chris? Someplace around. There's Chris, and Jeff from the Stockdale Center. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I feel privileged to be here. I'm certainly not the most famous Brookings person to be here in recent years. My current boss, retired General John Allen, served as the commandant of midshipmen here for several years, and so it's a privilege to be affiliated with him and then to reconnect in his name, Brookings, to the Naval Academy. I'm particularly pleased to be speaking in a series that looks simultaneously at history and strategy, which is very much integral to the design of the book, and connected to issues of leadership. And the book is written very much about the question of leadership of the international system, leadership of international order, and how that relates to sea power in its modern form. I should say in a room like this, it is not a Mahanian book. It certainly casts back in part to some of the traditions of Mahan, but it looks at a range of issues in contemporary leadership that would not have been familiar to Mahan: global energy flows, climate change, digital trade, etc. Nonetheless, the central question of what it means to maintain command of the seas, to be able to deploy a global navy, is central to the issues I address in the book, which is of course available at Amazon for the low price of $28.99. Please feel free to order. And it's a privilege also to talk to an audience that's so knowledgeable about naval issues, but also one, if I look at the faculty in your writings, which I frequently do, and your tweetings, which I frequently do, which doesn't understand that leadership goes well beyond the military domain and the naval domain, and there are sort of wider diplomatic and economic strategic issues at play. And of course, I wrote the book at a time when questions of American leadership are contested internally and challenged externally. Most importantly, I would argue, by China's return to the sea for the first time since the mid-1500s, which we'll talk about. Chris asked me if I wanted to use PowerPoint. Sometimes when I talk to public audiences, I use maps. I think you guys know where the Red Sea is and where the South China Sea connects to the East China Sea, so I'm not. Plus, I'm a big believer in the old saying that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'll avoid the slides for today. And what I thought I'd do is talk sort of 20 minutes or so, covering a range of issues in the book and not going too deep into any of them, and then be guided by your questions and comments of where it's of interest to explore with you, and I'll learn from you as we go. That being said, I do want to start where the book does, which is in a cave in a mountain. And that may seem like an odd place to start a book about competition on the oceans, but it's not just any cave. It's a very particular cave called Olasvern Naval Base, which is a submarine base dug into a giant mountain off a fjord 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It was, during the Cold War, as far as I can tell, NATO's northernmost vantage point for keeping an eye on the Russian fleet. At the end of the Cold War, it was closed as a naval facility, sold into private hands, used for recreational purposes. People would store their motorboats and their sailing craft there. And then 3 years ago was rapidly rehabilitated to military standards, reopened as a base by the Norwegian Ministry of Defense. And the first thing that happened was the United States signed a status of forces agreement, and there are once again American submarines stationed out of Olasvern Naval Base, keeping an eye on the Russian fleet. And I start the book there partly because it's just a dramatic, very James Bondian kind of place to engage an audience, go into this cavern in this cave and suddenly there are submarines, and it's all very James Bond. But mostly I started there because it's a location that illustrates several of the main themes of the book, right? Why are we back in the Arctic? First of all, we're back because the increasing pace of warming of the broader system is increasing the speed of the melt of the Arctic sea ice. But unlike the way you would read about these issues in a lot of the literature on climate change, what that's leading to is increased economic opportunity, right? Huge boon to fishing as the cold, as the ice melts, increases the temperature, decreases the temperature of the water, makes the water colder, which is very productive for fishing. There's huge new access for energy exploration, the Barents Sea, the Norwegian Sea. The largest natural gas find in the world in the last several years was in the Naval Peninsula in Russian waters off the Barents Sea. And it is, of course, now, for parts of the year, a commercial route for trade, and will, within roughly 20 years, be a full-time route for trade, doing to global trade distances what the opening of the Suez Canal did in the 1860s, having the time it takes to ship goods from Asia to North America. It's a commercial phenomenon, it's an energy phenomenon, it's a climate phenomenon. But if you step back a little bit and you think about the way we've talked about these kinds of issues over the last couple of decades, globalization, climate change, these were supposed to be things that were knitting countries together. And a central theme of the book is it kind of contrary to that wisdom, that actually sea-based globalization, the ocean-based dynamics of climate change, the ocean dynamics of energy, all of which I'll come to, are actually a central part of what is generating geopolitical tension. Naval contestation between us and the Chinese are not only the front lines of our contest, they're a central part of why we are now in the kind of rivalry we're in. And so the Arctic, I think, illustrates these themes nicely. Plus, it was fun to go. I go from there, I spent a little time in the Port of New York talking about how much it is that the US economy depends on sea-based trade. We can talk a little bit more about that in discussion. Obviously right now, watching what's happening in Long Beach, Los Angeles has kind of brought this home to Americans in a way that I think hadn't been particularly visible to a lot of Americans. One of the things I talk about in the book is the strange phenomenon that as global shipping grew in volumes and in scale, it moved out of downtown ports. It used to be that if you crossed the Brooklyn Bridge from Manhattan to Brooklyn, you were looking at the world's largest port. Now you're looking at a bunch of parks, right? And you have to go out into not the most pleasant part of New Jersey if you want to see what the Port of New York actually looks like. And people don't do that except when you kind of do like this as you drive to the airport. Right? And that's true all over the world. We've sort of lost sight of ports because they've been moved out of downtowns and they're off in the kind of industrial suburbs of the major cities. It's a kind of phenomenon, a kind of ironic phenomenon of the growth. But I go into the port of New Jersey and try to explore, showing people how much of the stuff that we get, that we eat, that we consume, that we use is brought in by sea. And as I said, right now we're sort of seeing that live on the kind of overhead shots of the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. I spend some time on that, and we can come back to it, but I try to kind of show both in trade and in finance and in commerce quite how consequential sea-based trade is to the US economy, much, much more so than I think is generally understood. And then go from there to history. And you all know this history, but I think it's often neglected. It's certainly neglected in the study of international relations. How consequential sea power has been through the last 500 years to the rise and fall of empires. No state, no country, no empire has maintained the pole position in world politics without simultaneously fielding the world's dominant navy. And I chart this sort of ironic moment, very familiar to you, where Europe finds its way to the Asian seas in the mid-1500s. The Portuguese, ironically, is the westernmost part of Europe that finds the route, because you have to go out further into the Atlantic to catch the trade routes down into Asia. They find their way into Asian waters at the precise moment when, for completely unrelated reasons, China pulls out of the oceans. China had a pretty sophisticated naval presence, or maritime presence, in the late 1400s, early 1500s. It's interesting, one of the little factoids I discovered along the way, when Benjamin Franklin was Postmaster General in London and did some of the earliest work on what became the field of oceanography, charting the currents of the Atlantic and the Gulf. One of the things he wrote about was Chinese hull design in the late 1400s, early 1500s, which were extremely advanced, the shape of the Chinese hulls. And later in the book, when I talk about the kind of explosion in global shipping, one of the things that happens that makes this huge expansion in global shipping possible is the adaptation of modern bulk shipping to a hull design written about by Ben Franklin, referring back to Chinese hull designs in the 1500s. Sort of strange to see those links. But it is this sort of ironic moment that Europe arrives in Asia just as the Chinese are pulling back, and that the fact of Europe dominating the seas, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, eventually the British for 200 years, without contestation from any of the Asian empires, which had sort of collapsed at the same time, sets up this moment in history where Europe is able to dominate the global stage, and does so until present day. Europe plus the United States, obviously, in the more modern period. And then, of course, as you all know very well, development of American naval power in the late 1800s goes back to an issue that BJ and I were just talking about, piracy in the Atlantic. Harassing American shipping in the Atlantic is what generates the move, the first post-independence move to form a full navy. And we go off to fight the Barbary Wars in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic, and there we find the birth of American Navy and the protection of commerce, right? And so that tie-in between naval power and the protection of commerce is a central theme in the book, and I'll come back to it. Obviously, the United States then takes over as the world's largest navy by about the 1900s, and then inherits a lot of the infrastructure of the British Navy, the Royal Navy, at the end of the Second World War. I don't spend a lot of time on World War II naval history. That's available in lots of other places. But that brings us to the end of the the end of World War II, and then I turn in the post-Cold War period to trade. And the story I tell in that part of the book is really about this huge growth in sea-based trade, right? And the numbers here are simple. If you look at economic growth from the 1950s to present day, it's on a line like this. The exact same line is the line of the volume of bulk shipping. The exact same line is the line of the capacity of bulk shipping carriers. The expansion in bulk shipping and the expansion of trade are the same thing from the mid-50s on, 1950s onwards. It starts in Newark, New Jersey with the first containerized ship carrying a whopping 56 containers. One of the things I did on the book is spend about 9 days on what was then the largest bulk container shipping ship in the world, Madrid Maersk, carried 20,526 containers, a little bit bigger. And I chart back to the founding of the Maersk company and the Maersk family. It's striking to me. I went to the Maersk Museum where Peter Maersk, the founder of the company, has his diary, his notes. And I read his diary from the first ship that he sailed in the Baltics, which carried about the equivalent of 26 containers of goods today. and sailed with a crew of 26. I was on that ship with 20,526 containers and a crew of 24. All right, so it's a 17,000% increase in the efficiency of shipping in 100 years. I don't know of any other field that's had anything remotely like that scale of increase in efficiency. And it is the backbone of global trade. We talk about globalization, we think about airplanes and data flows and service industry and all this kind of stuff. 85% of goods in the world flow by sea. Globalization is a sea-based phenomenon. By the way, the Wall Street Journal, they did a very nice review of the book, but one of the things they said is, well, of course, it doesn't apply to modern industry because it's all about technology. Missing the point that 93% of all data in the world flows by undersea cables. Our finance systems, our technological systems, our social media, our political systems all rely on the flow of data on undersea cables, which are probably the most important and most vulnerable networks of contemporary globalization. I spent some time in the book. I said I spent some time in the port of New York. I also went to the container port south of Shanghai, Yangshan port. And I did that in part to illustrate the kind of change in the nature of trade over this period of time. If you go back to the 1950s and you look at where the largest ports in the world were, they're all in the West, right? It's New York and Los Angeles and London and Rotterdam and et cetera. Then a very interesting phenomenon happens, which is the United States Navy, and armed services more generally, I should be more inclusive, creates a logistics bridge to Korea to fight the Korean War. And then later creates a second logistics bridge to Vietnam to fight the Vietnam War via ports in Busan and Thailand, and et cetera. And essentially what that does is create a logistical pathway that enables bulk shipping to bring the Asian tigers into the global economy. And it seems to me there's a very direct tie between those geopolitical developments on the one hand and the creation of Asian economic growth in the 60s and the 70s and then into the 80s, encompassing Singapore and then fatefully encompassing Hong Kong. Of course, Hong Kong was then a British outpost. It was a Western outpost of globalization, rapidly takes advantage of containerized shipping. I tell this story through the most important shipping family in Hong Kong at the time. The Tungs, C.H. Tung, became the first independent governor of Hong Kong. His father, C.Y. Tung, started on the piers of Shanghai and created the largest shipping company in Asia. And I tell that story of the rise of Hong Kong through their eyes. But of course, then this very fateful thing happens, which having become, I think, the third largest port in the world by that point, with all the financial and legal and other apparatus that goes along with being a major hub for globalization, Hong Kong reverts to China. Okay? So this is the very beginning of the period when we're talking about the BRICS and the rising powers, et cetera. And it's India, and it's China, it's Brazil, and it's Nigeria, and the others. China's obviously larger than the rest, but India's pretty damn big too. And I describe in the book, it's like if there were four brothers, and they all went off to be entrepreneurs, and then one of them inherited the world's largest merchant bank. Well, guess which one succeeds compared to the rest, right? So China, just as it's entering the WTO, just as it's beginning to open to trade, reabsorbs the world's third largest container port, and with all the kind of networks of globalization that go along with it. This is a kind of giant rocket fuel boost to Chinese economic growth. And you look at port numbers after that. You go to the 1990s, it's still all the US and Europe plus Japan and Singapore, and then you start to see Shanghai come into the mix. And when I went to Yangshan port, this giant container port 2 hours south of Shanghai, all on reclaimed land, or most of it on reclaimed land, across the largest sea bridge in the world, was the largest. Now there's a second one which is even larger just north of Shanghai. This vast container port, the newest portion of which, by the way, has no human beings, all robotics and AI controlled, first port to achieve that in the world. That port last year processed 42 million container drops. Los Angeles Long Beach, which is the largest port in the United States, did 8 million container drops, okay? So 6 times larger than the largest port in the United States. The next 5 largest ports in the world are all also Chinese. So it just illustrates, we know this conceptually, right? We know the scale of the Chinese economy, but to see just the enormous weight that China has in sea-based trade is, I think, revealing of where we are in the world. I'm going to do this part a little bit out of sequence in the book, but I spent a lot of time on trade, commercial trade, and then I also spent a lot of time on energy and energy trade. Because whereas I think for some people at least, there's an awareness of how important ocean flows are for globalization and trade, it's remarkable to me, and I didn't know it, how how little we know about the role the oceans play in energy trade. I mean, of course, we know super tankers carrying oil across the fuel and stuff. But it's a super interesting story to watch the development of offshore energy exploration and offshore energy flows. And it is a story, by the way, that starts with the US Navy. It starts with the role of the US Navy in collaboration with Houston and Florida-based engineering firms engaged in a series of actually completely bizarro land Cold War experiments. One of them designed to drill through the Earth's crust. There's a move to drill through the Earth's crust. It was related to the space race with the Soviets. I can't remember exactly how. Somebody in the Army said, oh, we can do it in the Mojave Desert. The Navy says, no, let's do it off the coast of Hawaii because the first 8,000 miles are water, so it's a lot easier to drill through water than land. That's sort of true, except we didn't have any of the technologies required to sink a drill through water and then make it operate. But we created those technologies. It was a combination of Office of Naval Research and Houston-based engineering firms that sort of do that first deep sea drilling. And then about a decade later, there's, I'm going to forget the Project Azorian, which is this other slightly bizarro project where the Soviets had lost a sub, again off the waters of Hawaii. We wanted to find it. We didn't want them to know we'd found it, so we got Howard Hughes of the, the kind of car bizarre land millionaire to buy and furbish a research ship in his own name. We put a Navy crew and nuclear crew on that ship in confidence, a whole crazy story, but ultimately end up doing the most sophisticated subsea engineering project to date to rescue parts of that sub, and most of what becomes the technologies for offshore oil and gas exploration emerge from Project Azorian and reaching back to Project Mahul as well. And what we see then is this huge explosion in offshore energy exploration driven out of the United States. This is a story of the Gulf of Mexico in the first instance, but eventually of Brazil and of West Africa and then of the South China Sea and the Arctic. And fast forward to present day, 80% of the world's supply of oil and 60% of the world's supply in gas is either found at sea or moves by sea to its final destination. So somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world's supply in oil and gas depends at some point in its life on activities of the sea, either exploration or transportation. So oil and gas flows are hugely a consequence of the seas. And of course, much of it flowing to China, which I'll turn to in one moment. Before I do that, in the section on energy, I also spent some time on climate change. I may not spend too much time on that today. But I talked about this interesting role of the Navy in the engineering that results in modern offshore engineering. What I discovered too is that it's actually also the Navy that does most of the early science that leads to almost everything we know today about climate change. And the early oceanography of the US exploring expedition in the 1830s, I think it is, and then continuing in the 1860s, and then intensively at the start of the Second World War. The Office of Naval Research is by far and away the largest funder of science in the Second World War and immediate post-Second World War period. And Scripps Institution, all the major oceanographic institutions that are currently the bulwark of climate science come out of or grow up in this early partnership with Office of Naval Research. We're understanding the impact of nuclear testing at sea, tells us most of what we know about how chemical transitions in the water deal with carbon. Most of modern climate science emerges from that study, and we still are vastly the most important set of institutions of climate science and oceanography, something I think we often forget and never talk about and should talk a lot more about as a kind of a feature of leadership in the international system. But coming back to energy, offshore energy flows and flows into China's market, okay? 70% of the energy, maybe 60% now of the energy that China consumes flows into their economy by sea. And so in the core of the book is the question of China's reaction to being an economy with this vast stake in sea-based trade and this vast dependent on the inflow of liquid fuels of oil and gas by sea. And I tell essentially an evolutionary story about Chinese strategy. Some of the China scholars out there are more convinced than I am that China has had a kind of a clear-eyed determination to emerge as the top power in the world, and that's been their clear-eyed ambition throughout. I have a little bit more of a sense of of evolution. You know, I use the phrase in the book, power has its own appetite, so as they grow in power, they grow in ambition. As they grow in ambition, they grow in power, and et cetera. And certainly, it seems to me, when you look at this through the lens of China's Navy, you see an evolution from a long history of inland defense to an ability to muster the capability for coastal defense, to an early move into the near seas defense, deploying a Navy into the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, the Yellow Sea. And then this burgeoning understanding of how dependent their economy is becoming on the flow of trade through those waters and the flow of energy up through the Malacca Strait and the Ludok Strait, et cetera, Lombok Strait. And the expansion of their interest and their appetite and their ambition, interestingly enough, really gets ahead of steam as they join global counter-piracy efforts led by us. BJ and I were just talking about this, right? So starting in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, 2006, is this big surge in piracy attacks in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Somalia, and China joins our effort, the European effort, to do counter-piracy operations in those waters, leading to this very ironic, to my mind, bizarre phenomenon of China, Russia, and many other powers sailing under NATO coordination in that early period, right? Leading to a kind of scintillating sense that maybe it was the case that the scale of globalization and our shared dependence on global trade was going to lead us to find sort of comity in our relations. We were actually going to be able to coexist at sea, right? Harkening back to the way American sea power is born in counter-piracy operations, but doesn't stay in counter-piracy operations. Seems to me the same thing is true of China's naval ambition. It may start in counter-piracy operations. It may have been sort of emboldened by a sense of the need to protect trade in the South China Sea and East China Sea. But at least as I understand the literature, as I understand your colleagues, the Naval War colleagues, as I understand your writings and my own interactions with the Chinese, I would say that their ambitions have leapfrogged that initial, more modest ambition. Partly that is a classic dynamic of capability. Once you have a certain capability, you want to protect that capability. It means you have to defend that capability forever further out, and so they're starting to worry about the second island chain. They're starting to worry about the wider Western Pacific. Started worrying about the Indian Ocean. They're worried about the supply of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf. But it seems to me that at the same time, it's not only that the commercial reach that they're preoccupied by grows, the sense of ambition of what they could accomplish as they begin to develop a genuine blue water navy begins to grow as well. Not even to mention the extremely complicated question of Taiwan, which is inseparable in my mind from the development of their capacity in the near seas and the development of what they call a counterinsurgency capability, an ability to block us to reinforce our capabilities in the near seas. And so you see this really important evolution of Chinese naval ambition. At the same time, then Xi Jinping comes to power, and the overall terrain of Chinese ambition seems to me it expands pretty substantially. And so I end the book by describing a global naval arms race. Obviously, we and the Chinese are at the center of that arms race. Along the way, I trace a little bit of the resuscitation of the Russian fleet, expansion of the Indian fleet. Japan has a pretty powerful fleet, which is unshackling as we speak. Taiwan, Australia, there's a lot of players in this space. The British trying to find their way back to some of the bases that they haven't been as frequently visiting of late. We've seen the French. And we really are back into a world that looks an awful lot like the 1890s, the 1900s, the 1910s, as a series of major powers developed the naval capacity to compete in the Western Pacific, two more than the others, the United States and China, but not alone. And a dangerous, I think, arms race that we are embarked on and must win. I spent time, in order to tell that story, I spent some time on the John Paul Jones out of Hawaii ballistic missile defense ship down in the CIC and down in their weapon systems. Part of what I wanted to illustrate in the book for a kind of wider audience is how closely integrated technology and naval power are. Those are often talked about as two separate phenomena. It seems to me when you sit in the command information center of a ballistic missile destroyer, looking at the Aegis system, looking to the connections to the radars, to the satellites, to long range, etc., you begin to get an understanding of how profoundly infused into naval power is modern computing technology. Somebody who worked for me when I was vice president of Brookings is Rush Doshi. He's now the director for China in the NSC. And I called him the 2 days after my book was launched, because they had just announced the Australia, US, UK submarine deal, submarine and technology deal. I called him, I said, you know, it was awfully kind of you to launch that right to kind of help my book sales. But it was important, I thought, to highlight that is not just a submarine deal, it's a submarine and quantum computing and AI and undersea and technology deal, right? And it just goes to this point that naval power and technological power are so deeply infused with one another. I try to communicate that in the book and end by arguing, and we can debate this, but I end by arguing that the United States is going to have to retool its alliances to put together what amounts to a naval and technological alliance to deal with Chinese power in the Western Pacific, but not limited to the Western Pacific, in the Arctic, in the Indian Ocean, in the Southern Ocean, and beyond. I don't, in the book, suggest that naval power is a sufficient answer to China's challenge, right? So the central themes of the book have to do with this deep interplay between strategic power and economic power and other forms of power. I argue that if we're going to actually navigate through these waters ahead of us, we are going to have to remake globalization. That is going to be a hard, expensive thing to do. But to be in this historically very odd situation where we have the naval power to protect the flow of trade and energy to our largest rival, the tensions of that are going to become increasingly obvious and increasingly untenable. I think we will have to remake globalization. It's easy to say, really goddamn hard to do, excuse my political sciences. I think India looms extremely large in that, as it does in energy issues, as it does in climate issues, and I spend a certain amount of time in the book on that. But I want to end there by, I think, these kind of broader challenges, right? We're spending a lot of time these days thinking about what size of Navy do we need, what fleet design do we need, what technology do we need. Those are important debates to have, but we have to understand how the naval dimension of sea power relates to this much wider question of the nature of contemporary globalization, of the nature of modern energy flows. I would invoke the climate questions as well. I think they matter to the broader public debate, and the Navy has a critical role to play in understanding them. I think that helps us navigate through these waters. But having that wider understanding of sea power and of leadership, I think, is the right way to begin to think about national strategy at this moment, and not just in the military domain. So let me end on that point and be happy to take your thoughts, comments, discussions, questions, and go wherever you want to go. There's always a prize for the first person to ask a question. So.
What do you think is going to happen with Taiwan, and what's the time frame?
Yeah. let's just skirt around the hard questions, right?
Softball.
Softball. So I do touch on it in the book. I don't dwell on it. I just point to some important developments. It seems to me that Japan, sort of coming out of the closet, so to speak, that it would actually come to the defense of Taiwan and Chinese. I mean, they weren't quite as precise as that, but they were pretty close. That's a pretty big deal if you're the Chinese Navy. We're thinking about mounting an operation in the Taiwan Strait. The fact that the Japanese submarine fleet might be part of the fight, that's an important deal. I'm persuaded by people who know more about it than me that it's unlikely to happen before the Olympics. Right? The Olympics are a pretty important thing for Xi. He's got to get through the 20th Party Congress. There's a series of internal political things he's going to take charge of. For the last several years, I've been 100% clear on the conclusion that Xi will reabsorb Taiwan. If he can do that politically, he will. I think the option of a political strategy is essentially foreclosed by what they did in Hong Kong. That means he only has a military strategy. He will try to do that. I can only give you as good an answer as anybody else writing the New York Times as when, but it's not going to be 20 years. I'd be surprised if it was 10. I think in the kind of 2 to 6 year time frame is a more realistic time frame that we should be looking at for when they're going to try. Unless, look, this is all unpredictable, other political things can happen. But if we assess currently, if Xi, as is almost certainly going to happen, gets a third term at the helm, all the dynamics that I see in Beijing right now are an incredibly intense closing in, a closing off of sort of lines of communication into Xi's office. He's extremely isolated now, very weak information flow into him, lots of opportunities for miscalculation in that, I think. All these articles in the US think tank world about how China may have peaked power, may be declining. That is not how Xi sees the world. I can tell you that with 100% confidence. Xi Jinping sees an ambitious future for himself and for China. He sees a lot of weakness in us. Not sure he's wrong. Sees a lot of weakness in Europe. So I'm very worried about that. I talk in the book briefly about the need for us to think about what I call multi-domain, multi-geography responses. In other words, it's not just about blocking their advances through the Taiwan Strait or reinforcing Taiwan through the Luzon Strait. It's also about, well, you know, fishing matters pretty fundamentally to them. We can harass their fishing fleet out of Angolan waters pretty damn easy. Oil access matters to them. We can choke off investments here, there, and everywhere. We could choke off their port access in Djibouti. There are a whole lot of things we can do to make their life costly and difficult a long, long way away from the East China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. I do not see as yet the planning for that or the conversations with allies that would have to be part of that process. But it strikes me as quite urgent that we do those two things.
Just to support what you just said, which I think is very convincing, probably the guy in these op-eds and so on who's made the case most strongly that China is weaker than many people think and weaker than they know would be Michael Beckley in his book Unrivaled in 2018, and then he and Mel Brands just published an article to say, if that's true, that's more reason to worry rather than less.
Yeah, it was funny. I thought their article, I tweeted a little bit about it yesterday because I thought it was a funny article because they say when China makes a preemptive military move, it's when they feel closed in and they feel like opportunities are closing in on them. And they give a whole series of historical examples and they end by saying, so what we should do is close in. It's like, what? Hold on a second, I didn't quite follow the logic of that one. We don't have a ton of good options, but it does seem to me that the farther out you go from the Taiwan Strait, the weaker Chinese power is, right? So they have a geographical dilemma in resource flows, in political access, in ports access, and all sorts of spheres that matter to them. Why we want to orient our fight mano a mano 80 miles off their coast rather than taking advantage of that broad geographical dilemma that they have, I do not understand. So for me, this strategy is not close. I mean, not by all means we should be building up our naval capacity and so whatever, but really that broader play has to be part of our strategy for Taiwan, I think. The back?
Yeah, sir, from your research, what have you, I guess, can you speak to what Xi Jinping would not be willing to sacrifice for Taiwan? I know it's a broad question.
Yeah. Internal control, I think, is essentially the only genuine answer, and that probably is an important check on him. Not that there are, in my estimation, I spent a lot of time with the intelligence community on this. Let me back up one step, okay? Pre-COVID, I would go multiple times a year to Beijing, and I have a series of interlocutors in Xi's office and in the key strategic think tanks, et cetera, right? And I watched this very interesting evolution in the dynamics of the conversations he would have and what people would be willing to tell you in groups and in small groups. By the time we were sort of 2019, every single conversation I had, financial elites, technology elites, political elites, strategic elites, intelligence elites, whatever, in their one-on-one conversation would complain bitterly about the mistakes that Xi Jinping was making. But you would not hear one whisper of that if there were two people in the room, right? Not a whisper. Unlike 5 years ago where you could have that debate with people, is she good or not, should she get a second term or not, are we going to become democratic or not? You could have that debate with people. That had changed. But everyone individually would criticize Xi. But ask anybody in that makeup who's the alternative node of power, and nobody has an answer. And he's been extremely systematic in taking out potential opposition through the counter-corruption campaign and in other moves, promoted loyalists, et cetera, right? So he's got a very tight internal grip on power. And people talk about the economic slowdown. Oh yeah, it's so slow, 8% growth, 6% growth. We should be so lucky, right? I mean, and everybody's aware of the huge growth that they've had. don't think we did ourselves any favor with the trade war moves. That gave him somebody to blame for some of the slowdown in growth rates, et cetera. If he launched an effort to retake Taiwan and lost or got badly stuck, which is a perfectly plausible scenario, that I think could crystallize a sense of this guy has made some fundamental mistakes and we've got to move. So that I'm reasonably sure is in the back of his mind. So his calculation is going to be, you know, are the Americans serious about responding? I think we look a little more serious than we did a few years ago. The fact that the Japanese and others coming to aid, that's going to matter. But the main thing he's going to want to know is, can I win, and can I win fast enough that it doesn't become an internal political challenge? That's the one thing he's not going to sacrifice for, in my estimation. Please.
And thank you for your presentation. I appreciate your expertise. My question is, given the opening trade routes in the North Atlantic, how do you perceive our defense posture?
How do you perceive which, sorry?
Our defense posture changing?
Yeah. Well, as I said, you know, there's a reason why there are American nuclear submarines back in the Arctic for the first time in 35 years, right? I mean, that's two factors. The Russians have increased the scale of their presence and the activity of their presence out of their northern base, sort of shifted the weight from some of their other bases. But it's also this very active commercial and scientific presence of the Chinese. You know, it's just one of the realities of oceanographic sciences. It's inherently dual use. Chinese have a pretty sophisticated scientific presence in the Arctic now. As we start to see Russia expanding its naval exercises up into the North Atlantic, which they're starting to do, it does seem to me we're going to have to start worrying about that route. I'm not too worried about it right now. I'll be a lot more worried about it 10 or 15 years from now when it's a full-time, you know, a year-round route, and the Chinese are starting to flow commercial goods through that to a much larger extent. Assuming we haven't gone through some deep crisis before then, I'll be more worried about 10 years from now than I am now. But I would certainly want to see us building up our, which we're starting to do, build up our presence and an allied presence in the Arctic. Interestingly enough, by the way, I learned the other day that we and the Indians are training for high, sort of low temperature, high altitude operations in the Arctic together. And that's an interesting phenomenon to see us and the Indians training together in the Arctic for those kinds of operations. And that, by the way, I do touch it in the book, that the kind of this steady shift, drift is the wrong word, shift by Delhi towards us and towards the Europeans is a really significant fact. I describe India as a 1,000-mile dagger in Chinese Indian Ocean ambitions, right? And the kind of Bay of Bengal, the Port Blair installations that they're building are significant. By the way, very long-winded to answer your question, but it's another place where people are going to have to factor in climate change. Climate change is going to play out in very different ways in terms of sea level rise and storm surges. The Bay of Bengal, again to use a political science term, is deeply screwed in those terms. And if you're building large-scale naval installations or port installations as the Chinese are doing in the Bay of Bengal, you better be calculating what happens 5, 10, 15 years out with a combination of sea level rise and storm surges, because that place is going to be hit, is already being hit very badly by those phenomena and will get worse. So for me, it was an interesting examination of the way climate change is going to play into these issues. Again, it's always talked about this, we're all in the same boat kind of thing. Well, no, we're not. I mean, it's going to play out dramatically different in the Bay of Bengal than it is in the South China Sea, than it is in the Gulf of Mexico, than it is in the Atlantic, and that's going to be a source of competition, not of collaboration, it seems to me, in the short term. So it does mean we have to have a global defense posture still, right? That is, of course, the central challenge. We're going to want to be dealing with the Chinese 80 miles off their coast while simultaneously maintaining a global posture.
So you started drifting into my question, which was about India.
Yeah.
And on the theme of allies and broadening the geographic scope of the challenge in China. Now, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about India. What's driving that shift? What they really care about, and what we could do to kind of accelerate that shift.
Yep.
What would you willing to bring that challenge?
Yeah, and I have to say it's one of the things I've been most pleased by in the last 2 or 3 years is the kind of I would say the operationalization of what had been a growing bipartisan sentiment that we should be doing things with the Indians, but that was kind of a sentiment more than a reality. But you know, the Quad has started to take real shape, and the early focused attention to the Quad in this administration has been important, but in the last administration they're doing the same. What's driving it? Look, they profoundly distrust the Chinese, right? They've fought 3 wars with them since independence, and as China has grown in scope and has been more bullying in their attitude to their neighbors, it was, I guess, in 2018 that the Indians found, no, it was 2020 when the Chinese turned off the lights in Bombay. That was pretty striking, you know, cyber penetration that can turn off the power grid in your largest city. It was not a pleasant reminder of the nature of Chinese power. So they're deeply and profoundly worried about Chinese power, and the only possible answer is us and the Europeans. I would say, by the way, the answer would be us, except that they have some questions about the credibility of us, and therefore it's us and the Europeans. How much that really helps is another question, but it's just striking to me to see the evolution of their thinking about us over the last several years and some real doubt about us. Nonetheless, looking to us and to Europe and to that naval partnership and technological partnership as a critical piece of their strategy. What I also talking about in the book is that, you know, here you have a country of 1.1 billion people, 5th largest economy in the world now. Look at through the prism of sea-based trade, they don't have a single port in the top 25. Okay, they have the 26th largest port in the world. It's just an indicator, a reflection of the fact that in real terms, they have not opened their economy in deep terms. They've talked about it, they sort of wanted to, they've kind of made some moves, we've kind of made some moves, they have not done it. If there were one thing that could allow us to genuinely remake globalization, it would be that. It would be India genuinely opening to the world economy, and that would generate a low-cost producer of goods that we're now currently dependent on China for. That is something that we could get done within a reasonable time frame. There is appetite for it inside Delhi. There's commercial appetite for it. If we think about the world right, we need it. So I have an article that I'm writing in my mind called Foreign Policy. You know, Biden has this foreign policy for the American middle class. It seems to me what we really need is a foreign policy for the Indian middle class, right? That would be what would actually allow us to remake globalization and deepen that partnership in a way that would be a genuine buttress against Chinese power.
One more question. Sir, as the Indians and Chinese have been basically having small skirmishes recently, how do you see...
Indians and Chinese, sorry?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
How do you see an opening of a second front and potential war with China impacting the naval fight?
You mean if there were to be a land war at the same time as a naval war, is that what you mean? Like
Yes.
if India and China were going at it in the north at the same time we were dealing with them in the Western Pacific, is that what you're asking?
Yes, sir.
I mean, it's an interesting point. I haven't thought about it in those terms. I'm struck that when you look at the nature of those skirmishes, it is not as if India is able to deploy large-scale infantry and sort of rocketry to those domains, right? This is sticks and clubs and handheld guns. This is sovereignty posturing and political and diplomatic posturing more than it is real military power posturing. That seems to me to be happening in a very different place, cyber being a central one and naval being the other. And so, you know, the real story in my mind is India deepening its port relationship and its naval relationship with all the kind of key islands across the Indian Ocean, and now working up into Vietnam and Singapore, and that sort of spreading its naval capacity into the surrounding waters and joining forces with us strikes me as more consequential. I can see a land war between the two, a fourth land war. I can see that happening. It does not look to me like India would pose a very substantial challenge to Chinese power in that scenario. They can absorb a lot of costs, but I don't think it would meaningfully limit what China could do in the naval space in the Western Pacific.
Okay, we're out of time. Midshipmen have to get to class. Dr. Jones will stick around for a few minutes afterwards, so if you have more questions and want to stick around and chat one-on-one, please hang out. This is our last First Bell lecture of this semester. We're going to have 3 at least next semester, so we're looking forward to seeing you all again starting in January. Dr.
And I would come around and mingle, but I'm not allowed to, so I will stay here behind the podium.